Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we are going to continue talking about Renaissance theater, but we're going to go to England, which means that we are going to talk as well about our good friend William Shakespeare. Now, before I get to talking about Shakespeare, I want to talk about iambic pentameter. Now, if you hear iambic pentameter in this context, you will think, well, that is the type of meter that Shakespeare wrote in. That's why his phrases seem to be all kind of the same length and sound kind of the same, right? Now, what verse is, it's essentially just spoken poetry, right? Poetry and dialogue. And different types of poetry or verse are categorized by what meter they follow. Now, what is a meter? What is meter? Now, in the English speaking world, meter is defined by two things roughly. The first is, well, the second really is how long or how long the phrase is. Really, what is the number of syllables? And the first is what is the combination of stressed and unstressed syllables? Do you repeat that many times over and over again? And if you think about, using those two ingredients, a stressed syllable and an unstressed syllable, you can mix them together in a few different ways, right? That you can repeat over and over again. Now, I am, you know, thinking about iambic. And I am is a combination, is two syllables, right? Where the first one is unstressed and the second one is stressed. So it goes bum, 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 over and over again. Words like today or believe, deny, right? Those sorts of words are in iambs, right? And so iambic meter is a whole bunch of iambs in a row, and pentameter, pent meaning five, like pentagon is a five-sided shape, right? So five iambs in a row, bum 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 bum, is iambic pentameter. It's really that easy. But of course, you can have other things, a trochee, words like gallop, martyr, or apple, right? You wouldn't say galop, mater, or a pole. No, just like you wouldn't say today, believe, deny, right? Those don't make sense. So gallop, martyr, and apple are all in trochees, right? So if you were, for example, instead of iambic pentameter, to have five trochees in a row, that would be trochaic pentameter, right? If you were to have uh, three trochees in a row, it would be trochaic trimeter, right? And now those are the two that you have with just two syllables, right? You can either have the stressed one first or the unstressed one first. Then we get to three in a row, right? This is not much in Shakespeare, but we're going to talk a little bit about it anyway, right? A dactyl is that's called a foot, incidentally, the combination that you repeat over and over again. The single unit is called a foot. So the dactyl is a foot that goes stressed, unstressed, unstressed. Words like scorpion, musical, terrible, right? Do you hear how the accent is on the first syllable? Like my name, Jonathan. Right? An amphibroch has the stressed syllable in the middle, right? Enormous, poetic, Medusa, right? In all of those words, the stressed is in the middle. And an anapest has the stressed syllable at the end, like understand, interrupt, contradict, right? Now, in Shakespeare, he usually does iambic pentameter. There are a couple of exceptions, which I'm going to get to in just a second. But mostly iambic pentameter. He sometimes writes in prose, right, which is no verse at all. It's just a paragraph. Okay? Um, Now, sometimes when you have a whole bunch of iambs in a row, right, you might start with a trochee, right? And so instead of going ba bum 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 ba bum, you could go ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum, right? And that trochee at the very beginning, instead of the first foot being an iamb, really does propel you into it, right? At the very end, the most famous line, perhaps in all of Shakespeare, is not a regular iambic pentameter, right? It goes to be or not to be, that is the question, right? As another little syllable at the end, an unstressed syllable. That has been in the past called a feminine ending, but that is ridiculous because it implies that women are weak. So it's now just called the weak ending, right? Which is an extra unstressed syllable at the end. To give you an example, and again, this poetry is not just used back in the day, right? You give an example of iambic pentameter from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, right? Um, Romeo looks up at Juliet and is like, "Oh my gosh, but soft what light through yonder window breaks. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she." Right? Do you hear the iambs? Right? Ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. Right? Five iambs in a row, iambic pentameter, and the Weeknd's "Save Your Tears" is also in iambic pentameter. You can sing this Romeo and Juliet's a song to the verse of "Save Your Tears," right? I saw you dancing in a crowded room. You look so happy when I'm not with you, but then you saw me, caught you by surprise, a single teardrop falling from your eyes, right? So this is just poetry, right? The Weeknd. Am I saying that the Weeknd is Shakespeare? No, but he definitely does use the same uh, structure in that song in particular. Now, Shakespeare mostly wrote in iambic pentameter, but sometimes he didn't, right? Um, and the second most common thing that he wrote in was something called trochaic quadrameter, right? So a trochee, bum bum, right, which is a stressed and then an unstressed. Quadrameter is four in a row. So things like double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron, bubble, right? Said by the witches in the Scottish play, right? Now the witches are a little bit more, they're a little less grounded in the real world. They're a little bit more fey, a little bit more um, fantastical and otherworldly, right? Which means that it would make sense that their speech would be a little bit more sing-songy, a little bit shorter, a little bit different, right? And Mr. Cobain, right, from Nirvana, and the chorus to "Smells Like Teen Spirit," he also does trochaic quadrameter with the lights out. It's less dangerous. Here we are now. Entertain us. I feel stupid and contagious. Here we are now. Entertain us. Right. Both examples of trochaic quadrameter. Do not get me started too much on pop songs and different meters because I will talk your head off about them all day. So then let's talk about Shakespeare. This fella, born April 23rd, 1564, in a little town called Stratford upon Avon. He was middle class, son of a glover. He was an actor and a playwright in London, right? He performed in his own plays. He was a part of a company or a troupe called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. Later on, they were called the King's Men when James came about, when there was a king. He had a number of theaters. The most famous was the Globe Theater. He also performed at like the Swan and the Rose. But the Globe Theater has been reconstructed. It exists in England, in London today. He wrote in every single style, right? He wrote tragedies, he wrote comedies, he wrote histories, he wrote all this sort of stuff. He is, unsurprisingly, the most produced playwright in the world. Uh, no one has written, well, no one has produced more than Shakespeare. Um, None of his plays are the most produced play, though. That honor belongs to Ibsen's Doll's House. But he's the most produced playwright. His works are quoted more often than anything but the Bible, right, in English. Incidentally, it is proper in terms of citations to just cite his plays and not necessarily have to cite him as the author of them, right? When you're doing inline citations, it's so much a part of English culture. He has contributed more than 8,000 words to the English language, right? He has contributed more words to English than anyone else. He died April 23rd, 1616, and the first folio, right, which was kind of a collection of his plays, was published in 1623. Now, some words that Shakespeare came up with, and now we have words like, lackluster, laughable, uh, pious, revolting, gossip, pander, varied, useful, upstairs, right? All of these sorts of words were invented by Shakespeare, and we use them just every day because they're normal words now. Now he wrote tons of plays, right? His plays can be almost broken up into two different phases, right, or two different time periods. He wrote under Queen Elizabeth I, right? This was Elizabethan, named obviously for the Queen, right? He started out writing a whole bunch of histories, right? Henry IV, parts two, three, and one. Richard III. He wrote then, comedies, histories, a couple of tragedies as well. A lot of heavy hitters are in this, right? Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Merchant of Venice, um, Hamlet, right? Julius Caesar, and then uh, Elizabeth died, and James I became king. He wrote more plays under him. The Jacobean, right, under James. Period. Macbeth, uh, The Tempest, Measure for Measure, Othello. Measure for Measure is my favorite play, by the way, of all of them. Now, Shakespeare, his comedies, right, like Comedy of Errors, Much Ado About Nothing, Midsummer Night's Dream, Taming of the Shrew, etc. They had an emphasis on plot relative to character. Now, that's something that you actually see all the way from ancient Greece. When you have comedy, it's a little bit more about plot. When you have tragedy, it shades a little bit more toward character work. His comedies were often about the separation and reunification of lovers, and there was mistaken identity, cross dressing, all this sort of stuff in his comedies. He wrote a lot of history plays dealing with, English history. They're mostly kind of heroic epics that celebrate founders of the Tudor line, and this woman was a Tudor, so there you go, that makes sense. And most of them dealt with war, right? War between England and France, for the most part. His tragedies, which are probably his most well-known plays as a whole, fall under this, right? Hamlet, Lear, Macbeth, Othello, right? R&J, Romeo and Juliet. Typically, they had high-status main characters, right? Um, going back to ancient Greece, right, where the tragic um, hero would be of a high status, right? These are about kings, um, princes, military leaders like Othello was. They were secular, though, right? They were not expressly religious per se. There was violence and murder on stage, right? Sword fighting, people dying, people getting poisoned, right? All this nice stuff. He also had these plays that were difficult to categorize, what they called his problem plays. At least this category was conceived by this scholar, F.S. Boas, in the late 19th century. These plays were a little bit more ambiguous in tone. They weren't straight tragedies, really, because it's not like the person dies at the end and you feel sad and terrible about life. They have happy endings, but they don't really satisfy very much, right? Um, like, uh, yeah. So in The Merchant of Venice, let's say, for example, The Merchant of Venice is a story about these two people, Antonio and Shylock, who were in Venice, right? Antonio is a Gentile. Shylock famously is Jewish, right? They're friends though, and they make this like silly wager, right? Where it's meant to be as a joke between the two of them, and they bet a pound of Antonio's flesh, right? And Shylock's like, yeah, okay, right. If you lose this bet, I'll get a pound of your flesh. If you lose, or if I lose, you get a pound of mine, right? And then later on, um, this thing doesn't happen, and Antonio loses this bet, but no one would really care except Shylock's daughter, Jessica, ran off with one of Antonio's friends, um, which makes Shylock very pissed off. And so he's like, you know what? We have this contract. I'm actually going to try to enforce this. I want to get a pound of this guy's flesh because I'm pissed off that my daughter ran off with this guy who was his friend. And now at the end of this play, right, um, one of the other characters, Portia, who is like, cross-dressing as a lawyer. This woman is cross-dressing as a lawyer, but she uh, 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 essentially lawyers her way to saying, okay, so you can take a pound of flesh, Shylock. That is the rule, but your contract did not stipulate any blood. So you have to take a pound of flesh without spilling any of his blood. That's the only way. Because if you do spill any of Antonio's blood while taking the pound of flesh, you will be in breach of contract and you will be, killed by the state. Right. And so it seems to be kind of satisfying because we don't really want Antonio to die, but we also feel very, very sorry for Shylock. And he gets stripped of all of his possessions. They're given to the state as well, and so we're just kind of like, well, this is good-ish, but we really don't kind of like it. So those sorts of plays are Shakespeare's problem plays. He also wrote romances. Oh, romances like The Tempest, Pericles, Winter's Tale, Cymbeline. They have tragedies at the beginning, like often a shipwreck, right? But they are resolved happily. However, lovers are kind of a side plot to the main deal. They're not, I mean, yeah, they call them romances as kind of a capital R genre of art called romantic, not kind of romance, like love between two people. There are a lot of fantastical characters, fairies, imps, sprites, encounters with magic, right? There were spectacular storms on stage and multiple locations, lots of different countries, right? These were uh, epic romances in this sort of way. Now, what did Elizabethan or Jacobean theater look like? Well, this is the first instance of scholastic theater, right? Theater that was in schools, right? So grammar schools, university, inns of court, where you would have, which was lawyers essentially putting on these plays and law schools. They had public playhouses, right? So open to the public. They were 3 stories high. There was an orchestra-like pit in the middle. However, it was not meant for performance. It was the groundlings, right, where you would pay standing room only to stand in the middle of this pit, right, and look up right in front of the stage. There was a balcony in the scena. You can actually see behind me. This is the other view of what you're seeing on this screen, but you can see the balcony, right? Which would be helpful in things like Romeo and Juliet, where there's a balcony. It was a thrust stage, right? And so even though it was kind of an oval, the building, the stage went out into the pit a little bit. There were repertory productions. Now, what that means is that you had a number of different plays who would be performing on the same stage consecutively, one each night. So let's say one night you would be performing Othello, the next night you would be performing Love's Labour's Lost, and then the next night you'd be performing Othello again. What that meant is that you couldn't build the sets, really. The stages were permanent, right? This wasn't like medieval theater where the stages moved, but the stages were permanent, but the sets weren't. And so the scenery you kind of had to move in and out. Um, Only men could act because sexism. Again, there was a troop system, and so you didn't hire a particular performer or a particular playwright. You hired a company, right? Like Shakespeare's King's Men or Lord Chamberlain's Men. And the writers who wrote these plays also acted in them. Writers did not retain their rights to their plays, which is interesting. When I talked about the first folio being published, you might think, well, why was it only published? Why were these plays only published as plays long after Shakespeare died? Like, wouldn't you want to have the script to give to all the actors? And the reason is not necessarily. What you would do is you would give each actor what were called their sides, right? Just their lines and the lines before theirs. That way, no one could go run off and produce that play on their own, right? Because writers did not have any copyright to their plays, right? They couldn't then kick someone out and then just produce their play because no one person had a copy of the entire thing, right? But together they had the play. And so it wasn't compiled into one piece until much later. And again, here is an unobstructed view, right? Yeah, I mean, again, this is the modern globe, right? And so there's a lot of things like railings and ADA, well, not Americans with Disabilities Act because it's in England, but the equivalent of accessibility features here, and obviously electricity that was not there. But it's roughly like how the Globe Theater was. Now, again, there was limited scenery. They did have, though, elaborate costumes because they had some spectacle, right? Because of the cost of the costumes and the repertory system, costumes were reused, right? The king in Romeo and Juliet could then be the king in King Lear the next night. And these elaborate costumes were often left in actors' wills. Again, all different parts of society, upper class, lower class, everyone saw these plays. Whereas, the poor people would stand in the middle underneath the rain, where the rich people would sit down under cover on the higher up seats. Although later into James's rule, dramas became more expensive, and therefore more rich people were the ones who could afford them. Some companies saw royal patronage, like we saw in Spain, right? Lord Chamberlain's men became the king's men. And interestingly enough, Shakespeare was not the only playwright during this period, right? Christopher Marlowe, this fellow on the left here, and Ben Jonson, that fellow on the right, also wrote um, their fair share of plays, and we would know a lot more. They would be a lot more famous if they were not overshadowed by the Bard. Now, there weren't just plays, right? Another popular form of entertainment in uh, more Jacobean theater, but also in Elizabethan, was the masque, right? It was courtly entertainment. It was not open to the public. It was by invitation only. You would hire these troops to perform these kind of skits-ish, where there was music, dancing, singing, acting. Set design was a big thing there as well. So performers were hired to do the singing and speaking parts, and other kind of courtiers were invited uh, to be a part of the fun, right? Just imagine a rich people party where it's like, yeah, you, a person who's rich, you come say a line or two, and that kind of thing. The imagery is often drawn from classical sources, um, and they were commissioned to celebrate, births, weddings, and other celebrations. Now, the first designer that we are going to talk about during our entire time is a fellow named Inigo Jones. Right? His influence on theater was not as a dramatist per se, not as an actor, playwright, or theoretician, but as a set designer and costume designer. He was actually trained as an architect, and he introduced a lot of technologies to the English theater, like the actual proscenium arch. Right? Most of the types of theaters that we've seen thus far, well, all of them have been kind of out into the audience some way, whether they've been, the having the orchestra jut out a little, or even the pageant wagons, um, which were kind of among the audience. He was the first one to introduce the proscenium, right? Movable scenery that you would set have in wheels and set in grooves on the floor to pull in and out. And he would put lighting and candles behind colored glass, right, to have colored lighting, which is pretty cool. So what happened? So the party couldn't last forever, and similar to the Middle Ages. This is the from the Acts and Ordinances of the Interregnum, in September 1642. Now, an interregnum is a period between monarchs. So there was a period in English history where Oliver Cromwell, who was not a monarch, um, became kind of protector of the realm, and he brought a Puritan um, temperament to the state of England, right? And so, in this Acts and Ordinances of the Interregnum, he said, whereas the distressed estate of Ireland, steeped in her own blood, and the distracted state of England, threatened with a cloud of blood by civil war, call for all possible means to appease and avert the wrath of God, do appear in these judgments, among which fasting and prayer, having been often tried to be very effectual, having been lightly and are still enjoined. And whereas public sports do not well agree with public calamities, nor public stage plays with the seasons of humiliation, this being an exercise of sad and pious solemnity, and the other being spectacles of pleasure, too commonly expressing lascivious mirth and levity. It is therefore thought fit and ordained by the Lords and Commons in this Parliament assembled, that while these sad causes and set times of humiliation do continue, public stage plays shall cease and be forborne. Instead of which are recommended to the people of this land the profitable and seasonable considerations of repentance, reconciliation, and peace with God, which probably may produce outward peace and prosperity and bring again times of joy and gladness to these nations. Right? So he's saying essentially times are terrible, right? There may be a civil war, right? Ireland is in a bad way. Um, and, you know, things being in a bad way don't really fit well with these stage plays, which people have fun in, right? How can you really, having fun does not fit with England being in a bad situation. So instead of having fun, we should pray instead. So therefore, no more plays, says the Lord Protector of the realm. So that kind of shut down theater for a while, and that's going to close England for us. Thank you very much again, and I will see you next time when you will have read Othello.